Chasing Lincoln's Killer, Chapter 5. Riding in open country about 10 miles south of Washington, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold would soon reach their own safe house. They did not expect any trouble along the road. They did not meet any soldiers as they rode toward Surratt's Tavern. If they did, there was no danger because they were riding ahead of the news of the assassination. At this moment, Booth could safely ride past an entire regiment of Union cavalry. Not a soul in Maryland knew yet that Abraham Lincoln had been shot. Within a few minutes of the assassination, the news began spreading, first by word of mouth from Ford's, then by messenger. It traveled no faster than a man could run on foot or ride on horseback. Between 10:30 and 11 p.m., more than 1,500 people spilled out from the theater onto the streets. They fanned out in all directions, like an unpaid army of newsboys shouting, "Extra!" Block by block, they spread the news. Men ran or galloped to the White House, the War Department, and the homes of cabinet officers. They rushed home and waked family members, knocked on the neighbors' doors, roused children from their beds, spreading the news. Washingtonians were used to getting important news this way. Tonight, like an inferno burning outward in all directions from a single ignition point, the news that Lincoln had been shot spread from Ford's in an ever-widening circle. A few blocks from Ford's, word of another apparent assassination spread from the Seward mansion and into the streets. Neighbors, soldiers, State Department employees, and even some reporters tried to enter the Seward house. Messengers fanned out in all directions, shouting from the Seward assassination just as the news spread from the Fords of the president's assassination. It was only a matter of time before the two groups, bringing word of separate attacks, met in the streets. The same words were exchanged countless times that night. "No, I tell you, it was Lincoln who was assassinated." "Impossible." "It was Seward. I just came from his house." "And I just came from Ford's. It was Lincoln." "It was Seward." Then the terrible truth emerged. It was both. Though unknown at the time, Seward still lived. Both men were attacked. The false information that Seward had been killed would continue to be spread through the word of mouth. At 13 and K Streets, someone rang the bell at the home of Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton. A brilliant man with a long record of public service, the president placed in his capable hands the most demanding tasks of the war, raising, training, equipping, and sending into battle the Army of the Union. Creating that army was the largest organizational achievement in American history up to that time. Stanton weeded out unfit and incompetent officers, battled dishonest government contractors who sold the Army low-quality uniforms, rotting equipment, and defective weapons, and endured an epidemic of officers who would not fight. If any man sat at Lincoln's right hand during the war, it was Edwin Stanton. Stanton had been among those to turn down the president's invitation to join him and Mary at Ford's Theater tonight. Instead, he left his office at the War Department and went home to dinner with his wife. Around 8 p.m., not long before the curtain rose at Ford's, Stanton left his house to visit his friend William H. Seward at his sickbed. Ever since the carriage accident Seward had suffered, Stanton had been a faithful visitor. He returned home about an hour later. After he bid some visiting Army officers good night, he closed his front door and locked it. It was 10 p.m. He walked upstairs and began undressing for bed. Not long after, the doorbell rang. His wife, still downstairs, unlocked and opened the door. If she had known about the murderous events of the evening, she most likely would not have opened the door. When she heard the, as it turned out, incorrect news from the messenger, she shouted, "Mr. Seward is murdered!" Her cry reached her husband upstairs, who did not believe what he had heard. "Humbug!" he shouted down. "I left him only an hour ago." Stanton, still doubting, came downstairs. He found the messenger and several other agitated men. Alarmed by their manner and their story, he decided to ride over to the Seward home to investigate the rumor of Seward's death personally. The ride to the Seward house took only a few minutes, and the first sign was not good. People filled the streets and crowded around Seward's front door. An hour ago, when Stanton had left the Seward home, the street was deserted. Stanton arrived moments before Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles reached Seward's house. A Navy Department messenger shouted unwelcome and, again, inaccurate news. President Lincoln had been shot, and Secretary Seward and his son Frederick had been assassinated. "Where," asked Welles, "was the president shot?" "At Ford's Theater," the messenger replied, adding that the Sewards had been attacked at home. "Damn the rebels," Welles cursed. "This is their work." He walked with the messenger to Seward's house. Stanton, just behind Wells, charged up the stairs to Seward's bedroom. It was true. A scene of mayhem replaced the calm that Stanton had seen a little more than an hour before. The bed was saturated with blood. Several doctors hovered over the bloody Secretary of State, working to save his life. Fanny Seward was wandering like a pale ghost, her dress dripping with blood. That was not all. Augustus Seward had been stabbed, and his brother Frederick was unconscious from a crushed skull. Brave Sergeant Robinson had endured multiple stab wounds. Recovering from their initial shock, Stanton and Wells realized that there was nothing they could do for the victims. It was in the hands of the doctors and God. They turned their thoughts to the president and the rest of the cabinet. Stanton gave orders to rush military guards to the home of every member of the cabinet and to the Vice President Johnson's hotel. Without guards or army escort, despite the danger that might still lurk in Washington, Stanton and Wells rode in a carriage to Ford's Theater. As the carriage clipped along, it passed men and women running crazily in all directions. The closer they got to Ford's, the thicker the crowds became. As the carriage turned down F Street, it approached a roaring, angry mob of thousands of people swarming in the street in front of Ford's. On 10th Street, Dr. Leal ordered Lincoln's bearers to head straight for the man with the candle standing at the top of the stairs at the Peterson House. The soldiers carried the president up the curved staircase. In this elevated position, the near lifeless body of Abraham Lincoln became visible to the entire crowd gathered below. In awe, the people watched as their president disappeared into the boarding house. Except for a handful of doctors, government officials, and family friends who had entered the Peterson House, that glimpse of the president ascending the stairs was the last time Americans saw Abraham Lincoln alive. Almost 13 miles out of Washington, Booth and Herold approached their destination, Surrattsville, Maryland. The town was small, little more than a crossroads outpost, named after the family that owned the tavern there. Before they could continue on their escape south, the fugitives had business at the tavern. They would pick up the shooting irons Mary Surratt had ordered Mr. Lloyd to get ready that afternoon. Surratt's place was hard to spot at night. The plain two-story structure was unpainted, and the dull wood boards reflected no moonlight. The tavern had served 3 functions: saloon, inn, and post office. In 1864, Mary Surratt, under a cloud of suspicion over her husband's loyalty to the Union, had moved her family to her Washington, D.C. boarding house and rented the tavern to John Lloyd. The tavern operated as a typical 19th century roadside establishment. It was divided into private and public spaces. Paying customers entered, not through the front door, but through a side door that led directly into the bar and post office. The room smelled like wax, candles, oil lamps, tobacco, burning stove wood, whiskey, dirty clothes, and leather boots. Drink and metal prices were posted on a wall or chalked on a board. Nighttime callers were not unusual. Booth and Herold rode their horses to the side entrance. The night was still. Inside, the tavern was quiet and dark. They had to make this quick. Herold dismounted and walked to the door while Booth remained in the saddle. They had no time to waste, and it would hurt Booth too much to dismount and put weight on his foot. Herold's pounding fist finally roused the innkeeper. John Lloyd climbed out of bed, went downstairs, and opened the side door. He recognized David Herold, a friend of John Surratt. Herold, impatient, hissed at him. "Lloyd, for God's sake, make haste and get those things." Herold did not have to be more specific. Lloyd knew what they wanted. After Mary Surratt's afternoon visit, he took the shooting irons from their hiding place so they would be ready for the callers. Lloyd returned in a moment, bearing a small package wrapped in twine, the binoculars, and a loaded Spencer repeating carbine. Booth would further arm himself when he picked up pistols at his next stop. As Herold and Booth prepared to ride away, Booth could not resist the temptation to brag. The impulsive actor had to tell someone of his achievement, or he would burst. He told Lloyd, "I am pretty certain that I have assassinated the President and Secretary Seward." Lloyd watched the pair ride off into the night, not understanding exactly what Booth had meant. He went back to bed. Booth and Herold had spent less than 5 minutes in Surrattsville. They continued to the southeast for an unplanned but necessary detour. Booth's leg was throbbing painfully. He needed a doctor, and he knew just where to find one, 4 hours' ride away. At the Peterson House, Abraham Lincoln would soon have more doctors than he could ever want, but little use for any of them. Abraham Lincoln's body was carried into the dim hallway that led to the rear of the boarding house. As the bearers shuffled along through the tight passageway, they passed the parlors and stepped into the back room. The boarder who rented the room was out for the evening, celebrating the end of the war. Leal examined the small room with a bed, its headboard wedged into the corner. He glanced around the room. This place would have to do. Chasing after the president, Mary Todd Lincoln, followed by Clara Harris and Major Rathbone, with Laura Keene trailing close behind, burst into the boarding house. Wringing her hands, Mrs. Lincoln pleaded, "Where is my husband? Where is my husband?" To no one in particular. In the back bedroom, only one person mattered now. Someone tore back the bedding. Someone else turned up the valve of the gas jet coming out of the wall. In an instant, the hissing, burning gas vapor lit the grotesque scene. The others laid the unconscious body across the mattress. Mary Todd Lincoln burst into the room, and the bright gaslight confirmed to her that this was not a nightmare as she had hoped it was. This was real. The air in the room was warm and moist, with too many people in it competing for the oxygen from the air. Leal ordered the windows opened and everyone but the doctors to leave the room. Mrs. Lincoln hovered over her husband. Leal gently encouraged her to leave the room and wait in the front parlor. Alone with their patient, the doctors worked quickly, removing the president's clothes. Strangers slipped into the Peterson house before guards could be posted at the door. People invading the house inched their way down the hallway closer to Lincoln. If someone did not take command of the situation soon, the house would be in chaos. Stanton's carriage came to a stop, unable to get through the crowd. If they could not drive through, they would walk. On foot, in the dark, in the midst of thousands of people, anything could happen that night. Indeed, it already had. But now Stanton and Willis exited the carriage, headed into the mob, and vanished from sight. The doctors examined Lincoln's body for knife or gunshot wounds, but found nothing other than the bullet hole in his head. The president's feet and legs were already getting cold. The eyelids were so filled with blood that they looked bruised, like someone had punched the president in the face. All signs were consistent with a catastrophic injury to the brain. The surgeons covered Lincoln's body with a sheet and blankets. His breathing was regular but heavy, interrupted with an occasional sigh. They laid a clean white napkin over the blood stains on the pillow. They placed a small chair at the head of the bed near Lincoln's face. Now the president was ready for Mary to see him again. Leal sent an officer to fetch her. She rushed into the room and sat beside her husband. "Love, live for but one moment to speak to me once, to speak to our children." Lincoln was deaf to her pleas.